Welcome back to the rocks and Gobos setup. In this part, we're going to just take a look at the room and the rendering and the light setup. We'll also take a look at how I used the Gobos that I created to create some nice shadows on the wall. Just a quick update, I'm using 19.0.622. I have installed 19.5, but to finish off this series, I'm just going to keep it in 19.0.622. Redshift I have updated and I'm using Redshift 3.5.05. I'm not using any of the new features like the new standard shader. Everything will still be the old, and then continuing from next month, we'll start looking at the standard shader and how we can use that to get some cool render settings. So let's jump in. So what I want to do here is just create some new space. And what we want to now do is create a geo container to create our room. So let's create a room. I will turn this back on and make this one lighter pink or lighter red. Dive inside. And our room is going to be a simple box. Obviously, we want our box to be a little bit bigger. So let's just go with something like this. So we have a nice long rectangle. And if we go into our wireframe and we ghost other things, you can see there's our rock and the room is maybe a little bit small. But for now, let's use a match size. And the match size is great. It lets you justify things to certain axes, I guess it's called. And so I'm going to set it to the min, and now it'll snap it to the floor, which is cool. This room is looking a little bit too small, so let's just increase the size. And maybe the roof doesn't need to be so tall. Maybe a little bit longer. And then what we'll do after this is just drop down a transform, and we can then move it backwards. So this is the rock is sitting at the end of our room. Then the next thing we want to do is just put our camera, because if we look at our camera now, it's looking at nothing. So we picked a camera of 180. I'm going to change this down to something like 80.5. And then I'm just going to zoom it in so that we go inside our room. There we go. And I don't want any rotation at all. Zero these out. And I actually don't want any X or Y, or maybe a little bit of Y to bring it down. And again, still the room is looking a little bit small. And what we can do now, because we have all our rocks in one scene, we could make our rocks smaller. But in this case, I'm just going to zoom back a bit more and make our room even bigger. Okay, that's starting to look maybe a little bit better. Maybe it can be full the frame a bit. I want this bottom piece to be about this size, but now I want this hero object to be a lot bigger. If you imagine a rule of thirds, this would be the bottom, and then I want the top to kind of bring into this section here. So what I can do is in this main scene is just grab this hero rock, and now I can easily just transform it and make it something a bit bigger. Okay, that's starting to look a little bit better. It may be a little bit too big, so maybe 1.3, a little bit bigger. And then this little rock, let's get this nicely wedged in here so that it's fitting nicely. At the moment, I can turn off our room. At the moment, it's feeling a little bit big, and so let's make it a bit smaller. And now I'm kind of wondering if I shouldn't, if I hit double M, I can get world space transform. I'm just going to try flip this around and see if this doesn't feel a little bit better. The only thing now is that this bottom is not flat, so that doesn't work. Now it's just a matter of playing and trying to find something cool with this rock that's going to work. All right, so for now, let's leave it at that. I don't want to spend too long tinkering here, but you can imagine that you can make it smaller and tuck it in and really play with this to get something that feels really good, that feels like this big rock is leaning on this small rock, so that this is giving it a little bit of support. And if we look at our camera, this rock, we want this face to actually face around, so we can turn it the other way around. Maybe something like that. And then this little rock can come forward a little bit and fit in this groove. And I'm just doing this by arm, just kind of seeing what I think would feel good in this situation and moving things around until it kind of feels like, yep, this would make sense in real life. Kind of. Not that you ever find these big rocks, but this kind of looks cool. And if I look at my camera, now we have this little rock that'll add a nice detail and a big rock, and it's filling the scene quite nicely. So if I look at my room, I have the floor and the background, and that's looking pretty good. The one thing that I may want to do inside my room, go back to the wireframe, is just move the whole room with my transform, just move it a little bit closer to my rocks. So I have this wall right behind it. The next thing I want to do is I want to cut out a section of this that would kind of be the window. And I'm just going to do this with a simple Boolean. So if I grab this, I can pull this over here and you can see it's cutting this out. I don't want this intersection. So I'm going to change the first one to a surface, and now it won't give me the intersection. It'll just cut it out. And so I'm going to move this all the way to the front and up. And how much of this I cut out is going to be very dependent on the light. And so I'm going to just cut out a small window here, and maybe we'll come back and change this if we need to. And maybe let's not cut out the floor, and just something like that. So when the light comes in, these edges are what's going to cause that nice shadow on the wall. So this looks great. Last thing I want to do is just add some UVs. So I'm going to use a UV unwrap. And so now if I have a look at my UVs, I have some nice UVs and I can map some textures onto this. So for right now, the room is looking good. And now we can set up some lighting. So I'm going to hit save, because if you've been watching any of my tutorials, I get a lot of crashes. I have updated Redshift and I haven't had as many crashes now that I've had Redshift going on the new version. So let's hope for the best. So I've got Redshift. I haven't started it yet. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a sunlight. Let's see if I hit go. So by default, this is what the sunlight gives me. And what I want to do is try and get some nice angular light. So I'm going to just move it. And there we go. Now you can see the sunlight is coming in through the window, if you would call it that. And what I'm going to do with this light is just move it out kind of to a position that would make sense. So this doesn't change the light at all, these coordinates, but it does let me kind of visualize it just a little bit more clearly. And now it's just a matter of playing and finding a cool angle. And as you can see now, I'm getting some blocking here. So I can come back into this and just see if I open this up a bit more, if it fixes anything. There we go. So that fixed it. If I just cut out that side. So if I bring this side back in, you can see that it's cutting, it's blocking my light. Now it's not blocking my light. So what I want to do with this sunlight is just dial in a little bit of the settings. I'm going to turn on this non-physical light. I'm going to turn down my intensity just so that it's a little bit better. I'm going to turn down the saturation so it's not so yellow. To get rid of this super straight line, which is not super realistic, I feel, I'm going to just set this to 3 and you can see it just blurs it a lot more. So this is 1, it's quite straight, and then a value of 3. And if I go up to 30, you can see it's super blurry. So depending on what you want, in this case, I just want something just a little bit so that it's not super straight. The next thing I want to do with my lighting is just add in a dome light. And what I want to do with this dome light is just add in like a full light for the whole scene. And so I just need some sort of sky or something that I can fill the scene with light. And so I'm going to go to my asset library and HDRI Haven. So these are all free. So I'm going to just use one of these and I can use any of them. Just try them out and see. Double click. And I don't want to see it in the viewport, so I'll just turn that off. But you can see now it starts to fill in the light. I'm not sure about that one. Let's try this snowfield. Here we go. So now the lights, if I turn this off, You can see it just kind of gives a nice like general light over everything. And if we rotate it around, I guess it doesn't change too much, and that's okay. I just want some subtle light across there. So now we can turn this back on and we start to get something. So let's add some basic materials just to start getting a feeling of the scene, and then we can start making some adjustments. So I'm gonna hit Control-1 to set this as a quick mark, Control-2 over here, jump to my out, and Control-3 on out, redshift, advanced, global illumination, I like to set it to 6. And in the RPR, I like to just turn on the live SOP level updates. Otherwise, I leave pretty much everything else as standard until something's not working, and then we can adjust it. And now we can start with the BG. And I'm actually we don't have a background, so I'm gonna just call this room. And I'll just apply this to the room. And let's just make this not so orange. And this is just a kind of a preset I have built. I have a slight orange color, and reflection, the weight and the roughness are set to 0.5 and 0.5. This is still the old redshift material, and I kind of use this as a starting point for things. And then this I'm going to call my hero rock. And then I'm going to say secondary rocks. And I'm going to use this for both the bottom one and the in-between one. And this can be the small rocks. Okay, so let's just quickly go and apply those to our rocks. Let's just add a material node. And depending on how we go with this, we may need to split these out because we may want different settings of displacement. But for now, we will just go with this and see how it goes. So for this one, we want our hero rock because that's our hero. And here we can just use our secondary rocks. And again, this can be our secondary rocks. And for our small rocks, we can just apply it here on the geometry level, small rocks. And on this, we definitely want to enable tessellation and displacement. And let's start with our hero rock. We've got a nice orange. And if I change this to make sure it's working, you can see it's working. So I'll undo that. And for now, we can actually kind of leave everything as it is. And we will just add in some displacement and then play a little bit more with our lighting. So for displacement, I'm going to use a max on noise and a displacement. And as you can see, that's working. I need this to be way lower, something like 0.003. And let's just get a section of this. You can use wavy turbulence as a really nice noise. Also really enjoy Naki for rocks. And maybe we can make the scale of this just a little bit smaller. That might be a bit too small. All right, let's have a look at that. So you can start to see some of the displacement coming out. Maybe it's too small. And something that I like to do with when I'm using displacement sometimes is just to have a look at the wireframe. So we can use a wireframe node and just plug this in just to see that I'm getting enough geometry for the displacement that I'm wanting. And so on this, I might just turn off screen space adaptive just to make sure that I'm getting proper topology. And let's just change this to 0 and 3. Okay, that's taking too long. Let's try 0 and 2. Okay, that's still really, really dense. So maybe 0 and 1. Okay, so this is where we were. So maybe 2 was about right. And now if we jump back into our materials, here a rock, plug this back in. You can start to see the displacement coming in. And now our lighting is really not helping us because we can't really see anything. So let's turn off this render region and just fix our lighting. So I kind of like this line over here, but I don't really like the fact that it's coming through our geometry here. I'd really like it to fall in front of it. And now for me, it's just a matter of moving this around and trying to find how to get that to work. So maybe in our room, I need to make this box bigger. And by making it bigger, you can see now I'm letting more light come on this way. And like I said, this is now just a little bit of a back and forth where I can dial in this light and then fix that too. So now I'm getting the edge up there and it's running in front here, which I really like. And now you can start to see the bump a lot more nicely. And if I turn off the HDRI, you can see how much darker it is inside this room. And so this just kind of brightens up the whole room really nicely. Let's jump back into this material. And I think this noise is still too small. So maybe let's make it a little bit bigger. And something else I want to do is just change this from 0 to 0, minus 0.5 and 0.5. So instead of just pushing outwards, it's now going to go in and out. And it just gives a slight difference so that you can start to feel the ridges just a little bit more nicely. Something else I think I want to do is just rotate this rock even more so that I'm not getting this flat side directly at the camera, but that it's facing more towards the window. Turn off my render view. Jump into my camera here. There we go. So now I'm seeing less of just the straight side, and hopefully I get some more details here that are a bit more visually interesting. And then this rock can just move back a little bit. Something I may want to do is to get a nice contact shadow here is I could also just use this rock and boolean out this rock. But because a lot of this will be hidden by some of the foliage that we'll add later on, for right now, I don't think I need to worry about that. But you definitely could. You could just grab this rock, boolean out this section or peak it up a bit to boolean it out, and then you'll see the intersection quite nicely. All right, that's starting to look good. I would like to get some better lighting here where I can kind of make out what these shapes are. So again, let's jump back into our sunlight and just see what this can do for us. Let me actually just turn off this light and just see if this light is contributing anything. And maybe it needs to. So we could try a different one, see what it does. So let's see what this one looks like. Yeah, that's just a bit too bright. So I'm going to go back to the snow field, which is just a little bit more flat lighting. And let's see if we can get the sunlight to do something cooler. All right, I'm going to leave that as is. It's not perfect and I definitely want to adjust it, but let me add some more materials into the scene and then we can come back and change it. So for the secondary rocks, I'm just going to steal this displacement. I'll pop that in, but I'm actually going to change this to wavy turbulence. It's a very cool noise that I like to use for these types of rocks and things. So you can see it kind of adds this like fun vibe. And of course you could stack noises. You could use a color layer and mix multiple noises and get them broken up. Redshift also has a scalar ramp. That's what it was called. And you can of course come in here and draw in a ramp just like we did in SOPs and kind of limit where your noise is. But for what we're doing here, this looks pretty good. Maybe let me increase the displacement size of this. We'll use the same on our small rocks. Let's go add displacement on those small rocks. And as these are really small, there doesn't need to be a lot of displacement, but just a small noise will add a nice subtle imperfections on there, right? Maybe even 0.1. And for now, the scene is going quite slowly. I'm going to just turn this down to 1. And for our final, we can turn it back up. For these small rocks, maybe we won't even use tessellation as they're so small. Yeah, so that looks cool. There's just a little bit of noise to them and maybe it's too small now. So maybe 1.6 will be good. And it just feels like they are smaller rocks, which is nice. So while I'm here, I'm just going to create another standard. I'm going to call this shadow or gobo. And inside here, I want to just create a gobo. So I won't have any reflection and If I go into the OD asset library, Gobos, I have these in texture supply, but these are the ones that I created. And I'm going to use this number one over here, and I'm going to plug it into the opacity color. So now if I go back into the OBJ level and I create a grid, I know that this grid that I am creating needs to be the same size as the image that I created. And so the image I created is 2.16 by 3.84. And then I can use a UV project to get some UVs on here. And then I can use a transform to make this much bigger. Initialize this. Let's call this Gobo. All right, so this is now blocking my light. I can make this a bit smaller. The reason I like to make it really big inside the SOP level container with the transform and then scale it here is that I get a little bit more control. All right, so if I get it right over here and make it a bit bigger, you can see it's blocking nearly all the light now. And if I apply my shadow material, we can try and get it so that we can see what's going on. So let's create another camera, camera 2. Let's jump into camera 2 and let's just zoom out so we can see. Let's refresh and have a look at camera 2. So now you can see that I have my gobo stretched out across here. And what I want to do is just make sure that this color is set to black, and this is stretched out quite far, so I could of course come back into here and change these dimensions or just squash it on the Z. If I jump back into camera 1, you can start to see that this is now starting to affect my wall and my rocks. So let's turn off the light dome. So I'm just looking at the sunlight now. Now it's a little bit easier to move this into place. I'm just trying to get the handle to be back on the object itself. I think now it is. And I'm just playing now with this. I'm not sure if there's anything specific I want to achieve, but I'm just looking to see what I can get. Of course, I can try some of the other gobos that I created, maybe this one or this one. And they're long and stretched because of the angle of the sunlight, as you can see here. I'm going to go back to number 1 just because there's more, it's kind of thinned out. So it gives like more of these streaks, which I like. Yeah, so something like that I think looks cool. If I switch this back on, you can see they're a lot more subtle, and maybe this even needs to be bigger. And maybe this was better, a little bit more squashed. If we look at camera number 2, you can see that this is what it's looking like. So the sun is hitting these and then it's casting the shadows on the wall. So you get some really nice shadows on the object itself and on the wall. And if you use the animated one, these will animate nicely and slowly through. So something that's fun to add to something like this is to go to your post effects, just add a LUT, gives it a nice warm tone, and let's give it some curves to see what that would look like. And you can see that that's starting to really make it pop a bit. And photographic exposure can be nice. It's also nice without, so I guess it's the personal preference at this point. Whatever you like to add to it. Let's do a bucket render and see how this looks. All right, so for the base shape or the base scene, this is where I got to, and I thought this was looking quite cool. And something else I wanted to do was add a nice texture onto the background. And so I can just create another preset here, BG, and this is going to be our, oh, I actually created a room so I can delete this. And in our room, I want to use a nice plaster material. So from megascans, they have a plaster. So I'm going to grab the surface. And if I scroll down, I have a wall plaster, and with OD tools, you can grab just like one of the textures, and I'm going to grab the displacement. So now I have this, and if I pipe this in, you can see you get this displacement, and so I can add it into a bump map. And now it's obviously very strong, but I can also do an ABS and just change the scale of this. Maybe a scale of 3. And Redshift is going a bit slow for me. Let's go to the side here. And then let's turn the bump scale way down. So you can start to see that you get this really nice breakup on the wall, and it feels a lot more natural to the scene. In my rocks, let's just change the color from this orange and make it a bit more white. And to do that, I'm actually going to add a bit of blue. So I'm just going to copy this color, copy parameter, and then in the secondary rocks, I'm just going to paste values. So that these rocks are the same, and the same with the small rocks. So now these are slightly different to everything around it. So it just gives it a bit of breakup in the scene. Maybe they're a bit too blue. So when I got to this point of the project, when I was doing it myself, I realized that it was still feeling a little bit boring, and I wanted a little bit more visual interest in the scene itself. And so I decided to try and add some plants. Luckily, I have some from megascans that I use all the time. So I'm going to just show you my workflow of how I usually do things with megascans. I use OD tools. You can use the 3D bridge. I dislike it. It's always broken. And I find that the OD tools method is really fun and easy to use. So let's go with that. I'm going to use this wheatgrass. It's like a dyed wheatgrass. And OD tools ask me which renderer I'm going to use. So I say Redshift, and it brings it in here. And if you look inside here, you can do it without OD tools, basically bringing in the file of each variation of this plant. So you can set the LOD, the level of detail, then it sets a variant attribute, and then it promotes it, deletes CD, adds a material, and then it scales it so that it's at world scale. And it creates a matnet over here with our material in here, which we will tackle in a bit. So what I want to do is I want to kind of paint an area where I want these to bloom from. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to object merge, and I want to object merge just these bottom rocks. So I'm going to create a merge, and it's going to be this one and this one. And if I look at my camera, you can see I've now got this, hide other objects. So I want to just scatter on these rocks here. So I'm going to create a null. Call this out scatter for plants. And this brown down, and in this one I'm going to create a null, and this is just going to be for our render. So I can copy this null and go to my here and paste that in there, and make sure that in this scene I'm on the render container. So over here I can now look at, I can go to the objects. Let me just double check that I'm not doing, okay, I need to make sure that I'm using this transform on this rock as well, otherwise it's not in the right place. And so what I can do is just be that onto that. And now we are in the right place with the rocks, and I can use an attribute paint. And I'm going to set the attribute to be density. And I can create a scatter node, And if I turn on density, it'll only go where I paint. So as I paint here, I go to my scatter node, you can see now it's adding the scatter to where I've painted. So this gives me a lot of control over where my scatter goes. So let's just paint in some areas where I want some of these scatters and points, and maybe I don't want so many, maybe 100. And then let's do a copy 2 points and copy these on. And I want to pack an instance and I want to use the variant attribute. So let's create an attribute adjust integer. And I know if I look here at my geo spreadsheet at the variants, I have 5 variants. So I can set this to random and 0.4. Actually, instead of random, let's do it with a noise. Sometimes a noise feels a little bit better with plants because you get little groupings. And now if I hit this, let's make this noise way smaller. All right, so now you get this, and they are on the wrong direction. They're going to be facing on the Z direction, just down here. So let's just set this to 90. And now when we copy it, all right, so it's picking up normals from my rock. So instead of scaling it like this, I'm just going to scale it here. And now it's right. But we're getting these issues. Have a look at my paint. So let's just erase this section here. And try now. Yeah, okay, so that fixed it. The other thing I want to do is do a mops randomize. So I can randomize orientation. And I know I just want to randomize it on the Z direction. And if I make this just something a little bit lower, now it just spins this around on this axis so they're not all facing in the same direction. We could add a very tiny bit of offset like this, but not too much, otherwise it looks a bit funny. And then let's change some of the uniform scale. So we get something a little bit different. And then if we look at our camera and show all objects, you can start to see these are happening in place. I don't want to randomize. I don't want these to be too aligned to one another. I want these to be kind of random. Instead of noise, let me just try this with a random. Okay, that's starting to feel better. There's just still a lot of the same here. I'm not seeing a lot of variation. I'd like to see a bit more. So I actually have 5 variants. I'm going to set it to 0 and 5. And I'm just trying to get some more randomness in this at the moment. All right, so that seems to be better now. I'm going to just turn off the OGL textures. Let's see if that's... Let's do an attribute randomize and see if I can get the p-scale better on this. I'm struggling to get this to break up in a very nice way. At the moment, it doesn't feel very random. There we go. Okay, so that's feeling more random already. The mops uniform scale was not working as well as I'd like. If you have a look at the mops uniform scale, it seems to be scaling them all the same. Whereas the mops, the attribute randomize seems to be working well. And now we have some nice rotations and everything else. So if we have a look at the scene now, you can see we have all these here. And now we have too many that are intersecting with the rock. So we can refine our paint so that it's a little bit further away from these rocks, but still around them. So let's do that quickly. So you can see here. So let's just reset this and just draw some a little bit further away from these rocks. Let's just ghost others and we can make the scale slightly smaller. I'm holding control to erase, and I just want to erase these over here so that these are not so thick. So I have a little bit of a gap. There we go. So now you can kind of see this rock, but these are growing nicely over there. I guess you could also paint in your p-scale values so that these were longer if you wanted, but I think this works quite nicely as well. So let's open up our render view and just see what this looks like. By default, I found the materials come in a bit strange and they need a little bit of work. So we'll look at how we do that. One thing that's very important to know is that these are now packed. So let's go into our instancing and instance top level packed primitives. This will load them a lot faster. I'm going to make this one purple so that I know that this one is a Quixel megascan. All right, so first things first, let's just delete some of these unused materials. I'm not going to use displacement on this. In fact, I'm not even going to use bump because they're so small and far away. For the color, I am going to use a color correct. And I'm going to just crank up the gamma and maybe pull down the saturation a little bit. And what I want to do in this translucency is just pull this down a whole lot as well and just crank up this translucency. And just like that, they start to feel a lot brighter and nicer. If this is set to a value of 1, it's still very dark. And maybe this is like more physically accurate, but it doesn't look as good in my scene. I want it to be quite bright. And I feel like these could be a little bit taller. So I can just jump out of this and go to the P scale and increase this. And with packed primitives, sometimes you just have to refresh. It doesn't always like for you to make changes like this on the fly. Yeah, that's starting to feel good. It's very oversaturated in orange. Let's just pull down the saturation even more. And that's starting to look really nice. Even once I had this, I felt like I wanted a little bit more variation. And so I just grabbed another megascans asset. So I'm going to go here. So I thought to try some flowers, and there's this white everlastings, which are quite nice. So I can just double click this. Oh, that was the wrong one. So I can delete that. I don't want mantra. And I want redshift. Let's make it purple. And what I want to do is just copy this. I can even copy to points. Dive into the white everlastings, and you can see there's a whole bunch of those here. I'll just paste this in here. And for the scatter, we can just randomize the seed, maybe add a few more. And we can maybe change the P scale to something smaller, just to add some random variation across the board. And we know here now, let's just check how many variants we have. We have 15, not 5. So we can go to the variants and add 15. And just like that, we can hit render and see what it looks like. We need to make sure that we instance top level packed primitives again, and make sure that we on our copy to points in the node. All right, again, these look fairly terrible. Let's turn off our wheatgrass and just have a look at these. Go into the material. And I'm just going to turn off these textures in the viewport. I can delete these. Displacement I won't use. Bump I'm not going to use. Again, I'm going to pretty much do what I did last time with the color correct. Just pop that in there. Give this a value of 1.5. I want a lot of backlight and translucency, and turn this down. You can start to see that these are brightening up a little bit. They're a little bit small, so let's just make them a bit bigger. Okay, something's definitely going wrong. Oh, we need to change the orientation of these as well. That would definitely help. Okay, these are huge for some reason. All right, there we go. That was my scale node was not connected. That was what I broke. So let's jump back in here. Okay, so now we have these really nice big flowers, and let's just rotate them. We can use a MOPS transform. This is sometimes a nice node to use and just mess around with the rotation values. Maybe we need to enumerate with an ID the points. And then if we rotate, you can see we get some random variation. The reason I use this enumerate is that the way that MOPS works is it works on an ID per point. And so now it's running this per point, and you can kind of just get some random variation. These are a little bit big now because I did crank it. And what I want to do now is use a custom ramp. I want some to be really nice and big, and I want the rest of them to be small. So maybe this is my small size. Let's make this bigger so that I have more control over my ramp. Small size, and we can have some big over here, small, big, small. Yeah, so this is a nice way you can kind of just control. You get some big ones and some small ones. It feels pretty good. Let's hit a render and see what this looks like. So now we start to see these creeping in, and they look quite good. We can maybe turn on our wheatgrass. And I think maybe this wheatgrass could even be a little bit bigger. Just to really fill out the scene and add in some niceness. Possibly what we can do is just add nice long wheatgrass in the back, and in the front there's not as much. Although I guess that's kind of what we have here. Maybe this section is being overrun and we can have more flowers here and less wheatgrass. So let's just do that. Let's just jump in here to this attribute paint and remove some of it here. So you can see the flowers will be more of a prominent over here, and there'll be less wheatgrass. Yeah, so I think that looks quite nice. So the flowers will be more of a hero. So let's finally just come into these flowers and just see if we can get these to look a bit brighter. Yeah, so now we get this really nice green that's coming through. We have our big hero rock here. And lastly, we can finally just play a little bit with the sun and just see if there's something else that maybe would work better. Maybe something like that. And I mean, see maybe this rock here, we can just make it a bit fatter. Let's just move it over a bit. Maybe 1.2 is a bit more realistic. Let's hit render. Yeah, so that just gives this middle rock a little bit more weight in the scene, which I really like. Of course, with the smaller rock, you can try different variations when you're creating the rock and try a different one. Maybe that's a little bit more prominent. That's what I ended up with in my final scene with the rock textures. Maybe this. Let's go back to 2 and let's just have a look at this noise finally. And then I think you get a very clear picture of kind of how I ended up with the scene that I ended up with. I spent a little bit more time just tweaking things and playing with some of the settings. But that's really just a personal preference. Once you get the base scene like this going, you just need to sit playing with different settings and trying different things, moving the lights around, trying adding in different HDRIs, the sun at different angles. Yeah, I think this noise texture works quite nicely. So let's just do a full scene bucket render and see how it looks. Yeah, so this is the final scene. It looks very similar to what I had in mind. As I said, I spent a little bit more time just tweaking things and playing with things. And obviously my rock was a little bit different just because of the seed and a number of different things. But you have the building blocks now and you can change things. So we've got noise on our rocks. We have a nice displacement or bump map on our wall. We have these cool little flowers bringing some visual interest. And we have this really nice gobo just breaking up the background, adding in some really nice subtleties. The last thing I want to show you is how I added in some motion into these plants, and I did it very simply. I used a simple motion from Quixel, and I'll show you what this looks like. If you plug this in and you hit play, you'll start to see that it moves things around. And if you hit this offset by connected geo, it moves like each thing on its own, and you can change the frequency. And you can see it just starts to move things. Maybe this frequency needs to be even lower or higher. and you just get some really basic noise. Now, obviously, this isn't perfect. It's moving the whole plant around, and you could maybe really spend some time getting that working. It's very similar to an attribute noise. And if you look inside this node, which you can do, you can see that they're basically just using a turbulent noise and plugging it into displacement. And so you could do this with an attribute noise, say 0 centered, a really nice low value, a nice small amount, and turn on animation. And you can see you get something similar. So it's a very similar thing to what they have going. Obviously, theirs is just packaged up, so it's a bit easier to use. So I just threw that on there, and then I used a labs make loop. So this will now take, if you set this to primitive, this will now take in your duration and it'll make a loop for you. So it'll just play perfectly from start to finish. So before, if you looked at the end here and you hit play, there'll be a jump, but with the make loop, it doesn't. So I just copied this and put this on this side as well. And now you get this kind of nice movement of these. And it's really subtle. And the ones that were going through the rock, I just deleted those ones, those pieces, so that they weren't super obvious. And the rest, then it's just some nice subtle motion. You can of course try and pin these bottom points or do a gradient through from the bottom up so that the bottom doesn't move as much as the top. I didn't actually end up doing that in mine. It just ended up working totally fine that I didn't need to do that. So I hope this has been fun. If you have any questions, of course, just let me know in the comments and I'll try and answer them as best as I can. Otherwise, I'll see you next month where we will tackle another fun project together.